bolts, hardware, whatever you want to call it. It's all very important for your dirt bike and to have in your shop. We got some tips for you on preventing problems and how to fix some problems when you come across them. Here you go. Okay, so the first thing is you want to have a good amount of hardware around. And nowadays, it's a lot easier to do so than it used to be. Spec Bolt, and there's some other companies, but we use Spec Bolt. They have cool little kits, and they can also be bike specific. So if you're going to do a bike build on, say, a YZ250, you can order a YZ250 kit for the chassis, for the plastic, and you can order one for the engine. So same thing with the CR250. You can order whatever you want. This is all KTM stuff, which has been new to us in the last few years. We didn't ride KTMs up until, what, 5 years ago? Really?
5 years ago.
Yeah. So now we have plenty, and we still like a lot of the other bikes, but the KTMs have come a long way. And you can see there's even some used bolts in here. See that one? It's kind of nasty looking. So this is a bolt that I would use on a friend of a friend who came over, a frenemy. We would use this bolt on his bike.
And his fork guards.
Those are fork guard bolts down low. So anyway, it's nice to have a nice kit. We're going to talk about drain bolts here in a minute, but on a good kit, you want to have these kits, and you can build these kits. And then over the years, I've built my own kits, and this has all just been done by saving anything left over from builds. Also, I found engines before, or gotten free engines, or found bikes that are people have dumped. We actually found them out in the hills. We've stripped them out and then just thrown everything away and kept all the bolts and hardware before you could buy kits. This is all small 5mm and under sized stuff. Kind of have washers organized and all small bits in here. So you want to have a way to organize. It doesn't have to be this elaborate, obviously, but you want to have a way to elaborate that. I'm going to talk about these in a minute too, on spacers. So I have all my spacers. These are all 6mm and 8mm spacers. And then these are all 6mm bolts, 8mm bolts that are kind of overstocked. These are all Allen heads, so I kind of have an area. I also have O-rings and that stuff in here, cotter pins. And then in here, this was Honda specific, all right here. It was all Honda. And then in here, what I've done is 10mm heads for 6mm bolts. They're 10mm heads, 8mm heads, and all Allen bolts like that. And then just some miscellaneous, lots of miscellaneous always. This is all KTM right here, and those other KTM kits go on top of it. Just a bunch of really cool things. Fast Company makes these cool spacers for the rim locks that are really cool. And then I have a lot of those types of things. And then I get down here, I have my larger sizes, 8 and 10mm size bolts and nuts. So you want to work on having a good selection of bolts. And if you're only riding one bike, you're not working on as many bikes as we are, you don't need to have a kit like that. Okay, so right here you can see these are a bunch of leftover hardware from a YZ build we did. Just a bunch of different stuff is all right here. And I've come up with some little containers and stuff that I'm going to fit up for Spencer's toolbox that we have up in Utah. And I got some different, I think I ate most of that. So we have these different boxes which work really nice in your toolbox. Is when you come across these kind of boxes, they can be really good to store your tools. Your tools, or in this case, hardware. I really like to store those things well. Having a tap on hand, I keep these two fitted up all the time. This is a 6mm by 1.25 and an 8mm by 1 tap. So these are the common sizes for all of the modern dirt bikes. And so these are on here. So if I pull something out, or if I see something's a little chingowed, we'll come in here, clean it up. And it doesn't make new threads, but it'll help clean up the beginning if you have a problem. So you want to have those things ready to go. Now, if you have a stripped threads, everybody uses the term helicoil because it's a common name like ketchup, whatever. So, but Timecert right here, this was actually sold by Kawasaki. They actually had these. So with Timecerts, what's nice about Timecerts is, first of all, well, they are way more expensive, but a way more professional way to do this. So what you do first is you drill out the spot. Then you countersink it to allow for this head right here that you see on this insert. Can you see that well there?
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to countersink it, and then we're going to tap it for this new size. With a helicoil, you don't get that kind of good contact. And then we're going to install it with this. And it just threads into here. And with the tap wrench like this, we'll just drive this in and install it. So Timesert is really the, I won't say the only way, but the best way. This is also a guide that's really cool that they sell now to help keep it straight when you're tapping. Okay, so if you have damaged threads, either buy it. These kits are like $80 to $100 a piece, and then these inserts, when you run out, Mick Fadendale out here in California has these inserts. You can also find them online. Timesert doesn't sell into California, of all cool, nice little features. We have to ship it to Utah. Okay, so we're going to talk about wrenches. See this wrench? It's only a 6-point, so it goes right on and just goes on here. Most wrenches people have are 12-point. The advantage of 12-point is you can grab in multiple spots. On these larger sizes, 12-point is usually okay, but on aluminum bolts or soft ones or smaller ones, they can start to round off a lot easier with a 12-point. So when you're going to do like a drain bolt, I would use a 6-point where you can really get on here nice and firm and you're nice and solid as you turn it with your wrench. That goes for a socket as well, same style. Drain bolts are the most common thing that we hear that is damaged that causes a lot of problems for guys, because a drain bolt, especially on a 4-stroke, can be very difficult to repair. Sometimes the engine has to be removed. It's going out the back of the engine, so the engine has to be removed to actually work on it. And then to install a Timesert, the engine would and you can do it without splitting the engine, but you need somebody qualified who's pretty good at making, you have some grease in there, and I've shot videos on that before, so you'll want to watch for that. So to repair those, the only real true way is with a Timesert. If you have damaged threads on a drain bolt, you'll want to remove the engine if you have to and put a Timesert in it. In some cases, if the case is cracked right there, you can actually split the engine and get it welded up and new hole drilled and rethreaded with a Timesert, because you're not going to have strong enough contact into the weld, so you'll want to have a Timesert in there. Also, a good machinist welder guy can help you with a lot of that stuff. So if you have a broken bolt that's in a spot, he can actually weld on a nut and build up some, and so that you can actually turn it and get it out so many times, rather than an easy out, which a lot of times just don't work. It can be very difficult to get in the center and actually use the easy out. Back to drain bolts. On drain bolts, it's really important to not over tighten these things. That's the most common problem, is that people are over tightening them, and then over time it gets tough. And as you pull them out, each time you take it out, if you feel that it's getting tight, put a new drain bolt in and run a new washer probably every 2 or 3 oil changes. If you're got plenty budget, do it every oil change. That'll allow it to crush down and you're not having to over tighten it to keep it from leaking. Hey, thanks for watching the video so far. Don't forget, if you're going to shop for new parts for your dirt bike at Rocky Mountain ATVMC, click on our link in the video description below. Okay, so now we're going to talk about spacers. See this right here? So as a rule, this number plate's a little bit different, but for most cases, when you are bolting up plastic to a bike, there's always a metal spacer. See how they got a metal, right here we'll call it like a collar, so that when you bolt down, you're not squishing plastic. If you put on side number plates, things like that, and you don't have a spacer on, you're just crushing the plastic, and eventually the plastic will end up popping out of there and you'll have this huge hole. So you always want to make sure you have a spacer that's appropriate and the right thickness. See, this one right here is actually the right thickness for this kind of plastic. So that's how you would test it, is hold up your spacer, make sure. If you have any questions, go to the Microfiche, the parts finder, and look up your bike and see that spacer. And if you have a selection of spacers, you can always do that and make sure that you have the correct thickness one in there. So the exception to a spacer would be when your bolt has a step like this. That's accomplishing the same thing. So this is stepping it out so that the plastic can fill from here to here, and you're bottoming out, and that you're not putting pressure on that plastic. Okay, so if you're not familiar with your good feel of bolts, a torque spec is very important. You can look up the torque specs in your manual or online. KTM Manuals online has them for all them, and if you don't have your book, you can search it and find out the torque specs for important matters so you don't break off bolts. That's one of the common things as guys are getting into the sport and learning, working on their bike. So you want to have a good torque wrench that you can set. Also, it's important to use the right thread lockers. So we have 3 right here, 222, 243, 263. So this would be the strongest one, medium, and low. And we use low a lot. We use it on the sprocket bolts, on the threads, and on the the part that touches the sprocket, the concave and convex part there. We'll use this like on your sprocket bolt, the main one, medium, and on maybe linkage bolts or shock bolts that are in problem bikes. Red is only for maybe internal engine parts, things that are really you don't ever want coming off, and they become more of a hassle when you do have red on there. Now, one tip, when you go to loosen anything with thread locker, use heat. Obviously, make sure you're in a well-vented area, but heat, a flame will heat it up, and that will loosen that thread locker. So some heat will help loosen those up. So remember that when you go to take it off, because if you go through, you can actually ruin the bolts. Either the head you can strip out, or the threads, you can actually damage them. So always use thread locker. And there's plenty of places where you don't need thread locker at all, but you actually want grease. Say the little caps for your brake, those little screws, you actually want grease on there. They will never come off. You just snug it. They'll never come off with grease on the concave, convex part where they meet. Not really so much on the threads, but right there. And they won't corrode and get stuck. On those brake caps, if those bolts do get stripped out where you can't even hit it with an impact or get it off, we've had to drill those out. We drill the head out, and then when you get the cap off, you can usually just simply unscrew those real easily. So that's a tip if you have to do that. When you're installing your countershaft sprocket, this tool from Sprocket Stuff is really cool because it holds the sprocket in place while we tighten it up with some medium thread locker. Okay, so one of the big bolts that creates a problem for guys is the chain adjuster bolt, this one right here. It's because this will start to get rounded off. Motion Pro sells new ones of these, and Works Connection has titanium ones. So it's a good idea to have a fresh one here with a good nut on here if you have any issues at all. Also, you want to put grease or anti-seize on here. It's just some good old looking anti-seize, and you'd want about like that much, and then it would rub into the threads. And I guess I'd maybe put a little bit more. I'd probably run it about like that, and you're going to be good. And this is something you'd want to do straight away on a new bike, or if you bought a used bike, you want to make sure that that's done. You have one of these, you can ruin a swing arm, and you have to pull a swing arm off to go get it repaired. It can be a very difficult and costly task. On a tank, aftermarket tank or stock tank, very common in the CRF 250s, KX 250s, and when they switch to carbureted bikes, these inserts right here would spin. And it's because there would be a lot of reasons for this, but a lot of times the plastic didn't fit well. The bike's been crashed, radiators are bent, aftermarket stuff just not lining up. Guys getting on here, and see if you're like sideways right here, when you try to start this bolt, it's brass, it'll start to take it. And you get cross-threaded. You get cross-threaded, it's game over. This thing's never coming apart. So what I like to do on these types of bolts right here is have grease on these threads. So you want to have grease on these threads. If one ever comes out, that's way better than spinning one of these inserts. Now, guys ask me how to fix it if one of these inserts comes out. You buy a new tank. So that's the easiest way. But I know not everyone has the budget to do that. And we've had some really interesting, I've had some guys help me. There are some ways where if the actual insert comes all the way out of the tank and there's still room there, then you can fill it with epoxy, like a Bondo. You could fill it with Bondo, drill a little hole, and then use a screw, like a KTM screw. You could put a screw in here and hold your shroud on. So that's one tip you could do. Some guys will actually then just drill up this and fill it with like JB Weld or Bondo type stuff. A JB Weld stuff would be better, anything like that, a putty, hard deal. Let it set up. A resin kind of deal where you can drill it out with a small hole and use a screw then from then on. So that would save you from having to get a new tank if you did that. Now, when it's stuck and you can't get the bolt off and the shroud's stuck to here and you want to put a new shroud on, then you're just going to have to keep spinning it with a gun till it gets hot, and it'll come out most of the time. And hopefully your tank is still good. So that's just something that we've dealt with over the years. And when we're spinning it with the gun, we have somebody holding a screwdriver under the plastic so that it's pulling it off as we go. So you can see we have experience with this kind of deal. We haven't had it, knock on wood, in 10 plus years. It was the older Hondas. When they switched to fuel to carbureted four-strokes, that seemed to be when we saw a lot more of these types of problems with spun inserts. And with these IMS tanks, we don't really have much of a problem ever. But again, we take our time, put grease on them, we make sure everything's lined up. If something's not lining up well, then either make the hole in the plastic bigger so when you push it, you lined up, or figure out what your clearance issue is. Okay, so our last tip is on when you have a stuck bolt, say in your front axle, your rear axle, or your swing arm pivot. This happens for a few different reasons, but the main reason is it's not greased well enough and it's been sitting for a long time, a year or 10, you know. And so what you'll want to do is get the nut off, and then you're going to have to start hitting it, and you want to hit it with something aluminum, like an aluminum bar. And I like to get the bike on its side. I'll show you how to do that. Okay, so if I was working on this pivot right here and it was stuck, I would have this off, and then I would use something like this brass piece to hopefully not damage the threads too bad. Once you get to a certain point, you know you're probably going to have to get a new pivot bolt. But many times you can get it out and it's still okay, but usually not. So I would get like here, and of course I'd have gloves on because that when you hit your hand, a strong hammer, and I'm going to be hitting it like this right here. And I'm getting a good hit. With the bike down on its side like this, I have way more leverage to do so. If you're working on the bike on a stand sideways like this, you don't have nearly as much control. So you want to be in a situation like that. And if I've had to do them on front wheels, in front wheels I would take the bike stand off the bar and I would have the bike all the way down on the ground and then work on the front wheel. We've had to do that. Same thing on the rear wheel. We've actually had to cut through the spacer on the rear wheel. That bad. Over at Brad's we've done it a couple times and once here. So not our bikes, but we've had to deal with it. So through buddies and so forth. Also, if you're not getting it to move at all, when you hit it with this, then you're going to want to soak it with something like a PB Blaster. And I would just come by here every hour or two. You're soaking it, you're squirting it in here, and soaking it in different places so that it tries to penetrate in here. And then just give it a tap, tap, and try to move it a little bit so that that stuff's getting in there. And then once you get it to move, then you're going to need a longer rod like this, preferably aluminum, steel, and you're holding it like this and giving it a tap here. You don't want to use a punch. We've seen this happen tons of times, and I'm laughing here because you get it stuck inside the hole, and you get it to move, and then you can't get the punch out of here. Very common. And that's been terrible. We've had that happen a few times. I've seen it happen over at Brad's a few times as well. So that should help you out in getting that unstuck if you're stuck. Okay, hopefully that helps you out with bolts, hardware, and some tips to help you out in fixing your bike and get you back on the track or trail. onX Off-Road, know where to go with the #1 GPS app. Access 500,000 miles of trails and roads, open dates and public lands. The elite version even shows landowners and property boundaries. Download the onX Off-Road app. To save 20%, use the discount code DBTV1.